Hey, thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
I'm Valerie Harris from ASSA ABLOY. I am the architectural rep for Orange County and San Bernardino County. And today's program is on disability access, having to do with door hardware and door hardware consulting. And it is a AIA approved program. So when you register with your AIA number, I will be registering you with AIA for having taken this class. It's also copyrighted material. I'm happy to share it as a PDF. So if you would like that, if you could put it in the chat, Marilee could let me know, or you can email me. The last slide has my email address. This course walks you through the process of selecting accessible doors and hardware and designing your doors to meet the requirements of Chapter 4 of ANSI A117.1. We'll talk about what that is in a few minutes. And it's a standard for accessible and usable buildings and facilities to comply with the American with Disabilities Act. And the California Building Code, chapters 11A and 11B, are based on it and very similar. So this program gives you one AIA learning unit in HSW. You can also get one State of California continuing education certificate on disability access. So I believe Marilee has a spot in the form to request the certificate if you ask for. Actually, I will just go ahead and send it to everybody that is on this program to your email address. And if there's a lot of us, it may take me a week or so, but I'll work on getting that out to you as soon as possible. The learning objectives on this program, what we'd like you to learn is we have to do the obligatory origins of the American with Disabilities Act and how that was adopted into California Building Code. We want you to understand how to select code compliant accessible hardware based on the code standards. And we would like you to understand what a clear and concise specification for accessible door hardware is. You probably will use a door hardware consultant to actually write the hardware sets. And we'd like you to identify differences in accessible openings versus openings that do not meet those requirements. And you do not want openings that do not meet the requirements that you discover when your person is coming through to do your inspection, because that gets to be stressful and expensive. There are several codes that affect accessibility. The reason for the codes are to provide better building construction with greater safety to the public, to provide uniformity of building laws, and to provide a method for policing the building materials and methods. And it is important to remember that the code is the minimum requirement for safeguarding life, health, public welfare, and property protection. There are sometimes it's a pretty low bar, and so there are a lot of options that provide greater usability, greater longevity, things like that. So just being code compliant is not necessarily the only criteria you want to think about. So most of the country uses the International Building Code, IBC, which is in accessibility is based around the Department of Justice guidelines and has been kind of codified into the ANSI Standard 117.1. California is kind of the same, but kind of not. So on this program, it is designed for a national audience. And so we've gone through and put in the California code information as kind of an add-on. So it may not be the most graphically exciting way, but sometimes I had to squish to get things in there. So that's why it might not be as graphically pleasing as our marketing department would like. So a code is adopted into law in whole or in part by a state, city, or other jurisdiction. And I have a typo there. California Building Standards Commission adopted the accessibility standards in the 2013 California Building Code. And the different entities like OSHPD, which is now HCI, and DSA have made some modifications to it as well. So door hardware is always a balance between life safety and security. And then I think it's a pyramid where we add in accessibility to that as well. So we're always, and those are kind of opposing things, that little teeter-totter there. So accessibility comes from the American with Disabilities Act. It's an application and there are administrative aspects to it. It covers many more things than doors and hardware, but we'll talk mostly about doors and doorways and door hardware. And a very important part of that that's often confusing is maneuvering clearances. So we'll talk about that quite a bit too. I'm not going to read all the charts and the numbers, but we'll talk about what it is and why it matters. And then we'll talk a little bit about the requirements on door hardware. So the American with Disabilities Act is a civil rights law that was passed in 1990. It's regulated by the Department of Justice, and Title III of the different parts of the law applies to public buildings. So what we're talking about here today is mostly found in Title III. The standard by the International Code Council and ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute, I think. A117.1, the current version is 2017, and it's called Accessible and Usable Building and Facilities. And it has door and hardware requirements that link up with the IBC more directly than it does with the CBC. So we'll talk about what some of those differences are. So California adopted the Department of Justice regulations with adjustments into the California Building Code in 2013, and then it's been adjusted in 2016 and 2022 codes. Both HCI, OSHPD, and DSA have made variations to it, sometimes without much notice. So it always makes things exciting when they change the requirements for that affects a product without a lot of warning. Not that we'd probably heed it anyway. We'd still go along blindly thinking it wasn't going to hit us in the butt, but it does. So California Building Code has 2 chapters about accessibility, just to make all of this a little more confusing. 11A is about housing accessibility. So that applies to multifamily, senior living, and only parts of mixed use properties. So some are covered under 11A and some under 11B. 11B is accessibility to public buildings, public accommodations, commercial buildings, and public housing. So if you're doing a public housing project, you're 11B. If you're doing a private senior living facility, you're 11A. And they're a little different. Chapter 1 is it's just the purpose and the intent of these sections, and that intent is to allow people with physical disabilities to independently get to, enter, and use a site, a facility, or an element. And a physical disability, I'm sure we probably all realize this, but it doesn't mean just a wheelchair, even though the international symbol is a wheelchair. People can have hidden disabilities like pulmonary problems, cardiac problems, arthritis that affects them sometimes and not others, being sight impaired, being hearing impaired. So the things that affect doors most often is a physical limitation. So my mother had Parkinson's for many years, and so getting through doors that did not have good accessibility always got me shutting the door or whacked with the door or her whacked with the door, which was a bigger problem than me. But so there's a lot going on that you have to be aware of. And having traveled a little bit in other countries, our accessibility is so much better, and I really missed it when it wasn't here or when I was over there. So chapter 4 is the main chapter having to do with accessibility, and a little bit about numbering. So 11B uses the same numbers as the ANSI standard. 11A has its own numbering system. So when we get there and we're talking about differences, I'll have the 11A numbering and the 11B numbering. And I probably should have done it on this slide, but I didn't. So the basic thing is that accessible routes shall comply with section 402. And an accessible route must have a walking surface with a slope of not steeper than 1 in 20. It has to have, if it has doors and doorways, they need to be accessible. If there are ramps, curb ramps, there are specific requirements for those, and then elevators and platform lifts are all part of an accessible route. So you'll see sometimes there are things that we can do designing a building which do not allow us to make that an accessible route. So we need to be aware of the difference of an accessible route. And there we go. So there are manual doors and doorways and manual gates, including tickets gates, and they all have to comply with section 404.2. So here's where it shows how that numbering is different. So 11B takes the same numbering system, so it's 11B-404.2, where in the residential 11A, numbering system for CBC, there is its own number, 1126A.1. And generally they say essentially the same things, but we'll talk about them when they're a little different. It applies to double leaf doors and gates, and on a double leaf, at least one of the leaves must comply with 404.2.2 and 2.3, and the 1126A1. And don't worry about the numbering. We'll just get there and we'll talk about what it takes to comply with those sections. And this is it. So this is where it gets a little messy. Sorry about that. So this is, I pulled out what 1126A.1, the residential, says, and it is a little less extensive than the 11B section, but this will get us started on this discussion. So doorways can be no less than 36 inches wide, not less than 80 inches tall, and when the door is open 90 degrees, it cannot be less than 32 inches clear to get through that doorway. So I have a picture later that shows how that's measured, but that 32 inches clear is what's very important. So if your wall geometry is a little off and you're at 31 and 11/16, that's not 32 inches clear. So that does not comply. And I have seen where walls have to be moved in order to accommodate that. Doors must be able to open at least 90 degrees. They can open more than that. That also applies to gates. And in pairs, at least one leaf must be 32 inches clear at 90 degrees. So you can do a 36-inch wide door with a 2-foot leaf, and that still meets the requirements for non-HCI projects of having 32 inches clear. And I thought of something else too, but it just left. Oh well, I'll get back to it, I'm sure. Oh, a 36-inch door is 1.75 inches thick. The hinge takes up a little bit of room, and the stop on the frame takes up a little bit of room. So a 36-inch door gives you about 32 3/8 of clearance, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on the hinges you're using. So you really just need to think in terms of at least a 36-inch wide door to get 32 inches clear. And so a 48-inch door will give you 44 inches clear, which is important in OSHPD HCI projects. So the components within the egress cannot be less than the minimum width. So if you put a bunch of molding or something on a door and the door gets thicker than 1.75 inches, you could impinge upon your 32 inches clear. So you need to be careful and watch for that. And then revolving doors or gates cannot be part of an accessible route. So there's where we're talking about where you need to consider an accessible route and a non-accessible route. So we don't use a lot of revolving doors here, but sometimes downtown or somewhere for some reason you have a revolving door. Generally, the solution to that is to put a swing door next to it so that that becomes your accessible path. So clear opening width creates a lot of angst for people and projects, and getting their project open, and not having huge phone calls or everybody standing around looking at the door. So this illustrates exactly what clear width is. The blue rectangle with the thing sticking out of it represents a frame of a door, and the part sticking out is the stop. So the door comes up, and that is what stops the door in the opening, so it just doesn't swing on through. In IBC, you have 4 inches maximum there to get you to the 32 inches clear, and that's all they really care about. But in California, OSHPD HCI also has the 7-inch rule, which is shown at the bottom, and that goes from the wall, which may or may not be at the edge of the frame, to where the door opens. It cannot obstruct any more than 7 inches into the corridor. Well, this is a big problem because a lot of door levers are like 3 5/8. So you get 2 levers, you get 1.75 inches thick door, you get a rose, maybe you have a hold open back there, and all of a sudden 7 inches gets pretty tricky. So, and if you're going into a hospital that had 8-foot corridors, but maybe they're a little wonky there where your door needs to go, and now all of a sudden you don't get your 8-foot corridor. So just be really careful when you're working in in OSHPD or HCI projects to think about that 7-inch max. Sometimes we can use a very low profile hardware for the levers, but those are usually low quality residential levers, and so you don't really want those in a hospital. So you just need to be more careful. So hardware, the accessibility guides affects things that are mounted between 34 inches and 80 inches off of finished floor. California has a much more restrictive amount, which we'll look at on another slide. And then here's a picture of how that clear width is measured. Usually the inspector takes a tape and measures it between the edge of the door and the stop. So this is the fun and lovely part of accessible doors, is maneuvering clearances. So these are important. So if someone is using a walker or a wheelchair, doesn't have a lot of upper body strength, they have room to be next to the door, open the door without hitting their wheelchair or walker, and then get through the door. And it matters whether you're approaching the door from the front, and there are pictures coming up that are diagrams that show this. If you're coming from the hinge side and the door pushes away from you or it pulls towards you, or if you're coming from the latch side and the door pushes or pulls away from you, you can look at these maneuvering clearances. And you see they range from 0 inches to 60 inches. So that can greatly affect the design that you have. And those have to be clear. You really shouldn't mount a trash can on the wall in that space. And then it also changes if there is a closer on the door, because the closer makes the door harder to open. So they require additional clearances often if there's a closer. So there is a way, the way around that is if you need the door to close because it's maybe access controlled, or it's a restroom door or something like that, you can always put a automatic opener, and there are less expensive automatic operators designed for this kind of issue. I would not put the cheap, inexpensive auto operator on your main front door, but if you have a public restroom, they're really good for that. And then sliding and folding doors also have maneuvering clearances. So the chart looks at if you're approaching the sliding door from the front, or if you're approaching it from the non-latch side or the latch side. And you can see that varies somewhat too, depending on if you can approach perpendicular to the door or if you're approaching parallel. So here's some of those pictures that I was talking about, which for me makes it easier to understand. So these first ones up here are talking about if you're going to have to roll up to this door, pull it open, back up, and get the door open, you're going to need space. So like 60 inches minimum. You also need a different amount of clearance at exterior doors and interior doors. Not sure why, but you just do. I think, well, and if you had an automatic door here, you would need a high-low operator. So you would, or a high-low actuator. So you would need room for that 36-inch bar. You can get by if you're pushing the door open, you don't have to be able to back up to get the door past your wheelchair, so you need much less space. However, you need to be able, if your dominant hand or your disabled hand is on this side, you need to be able to reach the door and be able to push it open. So that's why you need minimum clearance next to the door. And then if you're approaching from the sides, it makes a difference as well. And we won't go through all of these numbers, but just kind of note that there's a lot of different shapes. So if you're in doubt, I'd recommend you go to the code and look up what these requirements are for your specific opening that you're in question about. And so, for example, if a door has a closer, this dimension has to be at least 48 inches. It gives you time to get this door open, go through with your wheelchair, and then have the door close behind you, so that you're not getting hit with the door. Sliding doors are a little easier. Front approach, you just have to be able to have enough room to come over, turn your wheelchair, and then open the door. If you are approaching from the side, because there is not the 48 inches this way, you still need to have 42 inches, and then you need to have extra clearance here. So clearance means there's nothing there but wall, or something that is flush to the wall. So no large decorative plant, no trash can, no table. It has to be clear. In retrofit, sometimes not necessarily in the pocket or hinge, the door will have a decorative molding here, or there'll be part of the structure sticks out. The 1950s, 60s projects were great for having some big piece of the framing sticking out right next to the door, messing with the minimum clearances. So watch that. And then if you're coming from the latch side, which in a sliding door means where the door stops, you need to have a larger clearance. And so this is what I was talking about on that 1960s architecture. I once worked on a school project that every door had a piece of structural material. It was a masonry building, and it had decorative masonry on either side of the door, all 200-ish doors. So it created quite a challenge for it. And I think we ended up moving the doors to somewhere else in the wall. But I wasn't necessarily involved in that. I was just looking at it as a problem. So these kind of doors then just require extra space, and you've still got to be able to get your 32 inches clear in your minimum. So if the door recessed part is on the side away from the swing, it's much easier than if it's on the side with the swing. And then if you have vestibules, there's rules for that too, how far apart your doors can be, how much room you have to have between them, what your minimum clearances are. So, and it depends on if the doors both swing in the same direction. If the doors both open out, you have different requirements as well. If your doors are on adjacent walls, and you need to have additional maneuvering space in here, where you measure the 48 inches can be different. And then if you have doors on opposite walls, you still have to have your 48 inches between the door. So now you're getting 36 inches plus 48 inches plus 36 inches. So it becomes a pretty big vestibule. So besides all those numbers and measuring and what has to be clear, there are other requirements too. The floor landing has to be clear and level. You're measuring at right angles to the closed door. You're measuring the full width of the doorway. And there are different clearances on the latch and hinge side, and there might be different clearances based on if there's a closer on the door. So we kind of went through this twice already, so I think I will skip that. So when these are kind of the general numbers for being a front approach, being a side approach on the pull side, and then being a push approach, push side approach. And then if you're on the latch side, it changes as well. And then we just talked about the space between consecutive doors and gates. Don't forget, all of this applies to gates as well. If you have a doorway without a door or gate, or no sliding and folding door, you still need to have approaches to get through the doorway, 48 inches on each side. It doesn't have the strike edge requirement because you don't have a strike. A side approach is only 42 inches, And if you have a pocket or hinge side approach on a sliding door, it's 42 inches deep. And if you have a pocket where you're insetting the door into the wall, like an alcove, you have like 22 inches beyond the pocket on the hinge side. And then recessed doors come into play when something projects more than 8 inches. So the next point that causes a lot of consternation is thresholds. And Jeff, do we have any questions so far?
We do not. And folks, please feel free to go ahead and put your questions into chat. We'll read those periodically. What I would like to say, Valerie, because there are a few people that joined after the last time I said for today's registration, there are links in chat. Please go in there and fill that out. That's what Valerie is going to use in order to record your AIA learning units. So Valerie, I'll turn it back to you. I'll keep monitoring chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we've done the most horrible part of this presentation, all those numbers and dimensions. And the key takeaway for that is just pay attention, because you don't want it to be the inspector who points it out to you that you're not meeting it. So the next subject is thresholds. Thresholds and changes in elevation. So if you have a floor or landing, you can have an immediate bump up of 1/4 inch, and then you can have a 1 to 2 slope that does another 1/4 inch. So for a total of a 1/2 inch maximum at any accessible doorway. If you have a bigger gap that you need to make up, like the concrete is lower than a 1/2 inch from your floor, then you have to do a ramp. And so that's let me look. So the ramp is in section 1122A or in 404 2.4 in 11B. And the slope of the ramp is the same as any other slope. So then we get to door hardware. So that's also in section 404. And in 11A, it's in 126A.5 and 10.1 or 10.08 sections. So California code is a little different in several ways from the International Building Code. We require the hardware to be mounted between 34 and 48 inches. And in IBC, it says unless for security purposes. However, there are access control products on the door that the top of the card reader is above 48 inches. If you have the bottom of the block at 34, so some code officials don't mind that as long as you can get your card read between 34 and 48. And some do mind it. So you have to be careful with that. And then pools can be, oh, I see I have a typo up here where it says 30 inches. Oh, in California, it's 30 inches to 44. And in the IBC, it's 34 to 48. So you can see how that can create a kind of an issue sometimes with hardware that's designed to this standard. Pools have an exception where you can raise the self-latching but not locking pool hardware to a max of 54 inches. You also have to be able to use the hardware without grasping. So then hardware needs to be a lever with a return in California. In other areas, it does not have to have the return. And you can see they're demonstrating there how someone who has a neurological issue, one of the first things that go is their hands become kind of fist-like and they don't have the finger dexterity. So while most people can grab a lever with their hands, if you have that issue, when you have a return on the lever, it helps your hands stay on the lever. And then it needs to be a push button to lock the door generally. Little teeny thumb turns aren't good. If you have like an occupancy indicator, there are larger thumb turns that can be done with the side of a fist, and those are acceptable. And in California code, they added that sliding doors must, in fully open positions, you must be able to operate the hardware on both sides. So that pretty much eliminates flush pulls that go back into the opening or go back behind the door. Then door closers affect accessibility. So when a door closer, the door is open 90 degrees, the time to require the door to move to an open position of 12 degrees is 5 seconds minimum. This is a fire life safety requirement, so that in case of a fire, somebody goes through the door closes again. In a spring hinge, which is different than a closer, you go from 70 degrees, it has to close in 1.5 seconds minimum. So that's pretty quick, and people can get their fingers shut in that door. I know multifamily uses spring hinges a lot. A problem with spring hinges is they need pretty regular adjustment so that they don't either snap the door close and hurt people or close slower than the 1.5 seconds. Stack pressures in either from wind outside or stack pressures within a stairwell. There are cam action closers, which make it easier to get the door to close under the stack pressure and the wind basically, and to make sure it closes as a fire rated door. So what a cam action closer does is it makes it easier to open the door. So that makes it easier to meet the 5 pound of operating opening force requirements, and but it is stronger to close. So it will close all the way. It takes more force to close it. It produces more force, sorry. It produces more force in the closing action than it does in the opening action. So it makes it both easier to open for accessibility and easier to set it so that it'll close every time for fire life safety. And this is what spring hinges look like. And they require maintenance. I doubled up on this slide, sorry. And this is what a closer has, so much adjustability to it. All of these different things are ways it can be adjusted to, and major component parts so that it can be adjusted to meet the opening force requirements. So an interior hinge door, California A and B require 5 pounds maximum. Sliding or folding doors, 5 pounds maximum. DSA requires 5 pounds maximum on operating and opening forces. So what an operating force is like the force it takes to push an exit device bar down or to turn a lever or however you are operating that door hardware. And then California fire doors may be allowed by the authority having jurisdiction, usually the fire marshal, to have a little more than 5 pounds maximum, though DSA is the authority having jurisdictions for schools, and they are usually reluctant to make it more than 5 pounds, but other fire authorities can make it more, not to exceed 15 pounds. And then we already talked about cam action closers. So door surfaces are also regulated. So the bottom 10 inches of the door on all doors except all glass doors, and a glass door without vertical stiles is what has the exception. That can have a smaller rail that is tapered. And so if you were in a wheelchair, it wouldn't be an impediment because your wheelchair feet could ride along that taper and not get caught. But if you have the bar here, whoops. If you have the pull here on the push side of the door, it has to be above 10 inches. If your door can be pushed in both directions, they're both push sides of the door. So they both have to have 10 inches clear. And on a door that has a kick plate, watch out for panhead screws. The manufacturers all provide panhead screws in the packaging with the kick plate, but most door hardware consultants specify countersunk screws in countersunk holes in the kick plate. If you have 30 panhead screws along the top, bottom, and edges of that kick plate, it is not clear. It can be an impediment. So a countersunk screw, of course, fits flush with the kick plate. And then the kick plates should be beveled and free of sharp edges. And they can be no more than 1/16 of an inch thick. Vision lights have some changes as well. The code requires you to be able to either see through the light to see if there's someone on the other side of the door that might be short in stature or in a wheelchair, or it has to be so high that you're not mentally counting on being able to see someone on the other side of the door, so you might be more careful. So it's 43-inch maximum if you're going to have a light that goes partway down the door, and it's 66 inches or higher if you're going to have a light that's at the top of the door that most people can't see through. And for door hardware, you want to allow 6 inches between the edge of the door and the edge of the frame around the light, the side light, or a side light, so that you can mount the hardware there. If it's less than 6 inches and it has to be 43 inches maximum from the floor, and you have to mount your hardware within 30 inches to 44 inches, you may have to buy a new door if you didn't allow for 6 inches. Power operated or automatic doors, they have their own section, 404.3. There are 2 types of automatic doors, which confuses people. There's fully automatic doors, which comply with this BHMA standard, which is about 50 pages of test procedures. And that nowadays is almost always a sliding door, because part of the provisions for safety of a high-speed, fully powered automatic door is that there are 50 inches plus the width of your door of railings required around the door. So some of you are probably old enough to know the old school Targets that had big long railings that you had to walk between for their automatic doors. So now if you need a door that doesn't require a knowing act to open it, like if you walk up to it and it just opens automatically, you're pretty much stuck with having a sliding door. The other type of power door is a power assist or low energy door, and they also comply with a BHMA standard. It's the 0.19 instead of the 0.10. And that is actually listed in the code, that BHMA standard. And this requires for a safety feature of a knowing act to open the door. It's usually a wave to open or a touch actuator. And I think, I don't know, we'll probably get to this again too, but in exterior doors in California, not everywhere else, you need to have a high-low actuator, which could either be two square actuators if they're touched um, at the height required at the top, and then one at the bottom. Most people prefer the way a 36-inch long bar actuator looks. And for an exterior door, you have to have that kind of actuator on the inside of the door and the out exterior of the door. Automatic doors are really helpful in accessibility where you have a very smaller maneuvering clearance, or you have something that's in that space that you need to reserve for maneuvering clearances. So if you have an automatic door with a wave operator, you can overcome those clearances, because when you have an automatic door, it assumes you can just wave actuate or push the button to open the door and then go through, and it'll hold you open for a while. So it can help I've seen it used a lot when you're taking a restroom and you have enough of the circle clearance and all that stuff, but there's like a sink that's like 2 inches too close to the door. You can put in a operator that's usually around $1,000 or so, and now you don't have to rip the whole bathroom apart and make it bigger. Actuators. So here's where the high-low actuators are. So in California, the 6-inch square push actuators are the only international accessible symbol that's permitted. In other states, there are other like racing wheelchairs and where you just have words or something like that that are accessible, but not in California. And the wave to open actuators, there's currently no size requirement on those. A touch actuator needs to be 6 inches square. And that's what I have. Jeff, were there any questions that came up? Or did I just numb everyone with all those numbers?
No, I think you did such a fantastic job. They haven't put anything in there.
Okay, great. So here is my email address. If you would like to get a PDF copy of this presentation, I'll be glad to send it to you. And oh, it's not a net zero certificate that I send for this one. It is a accessibility certificate to document your 1 hour of accessible learning for your California licensing renewal. And then that concludes this presentation.
Excuse me, Valerie, there is a question in
Yeah,
chat.
there's
Oh,
one
sure.
that just,
Two.
there's two now that just came through.
Okay.
Let me get back up to it. For a power assist swing door and after waving the actuator, what is the max force allowed to stop door and have it open again?
There's usually a sensor on the edge of the door that if it senses somebody, it stops. And if you're not using a sensor, I'm not sure what the maximum is. If you send me an email, I can find out.
All right, and the next one is, I think it's please verify exit devices require 5 pounds of pressure for DSA projects.
Yes. We know that from a door hardware perspective of it. It was very painful the day after they decided that that was now required. So there's two 5 pounds involved in exit devices. There's the 5 pounds to push the bar, and then there is 5 pounds to open the door, which is called um, opening force. And they're measured usually with like a scale. Used to be a fish scale, but I think there's now like accessibility scales. So it's hooked onto the door and you pull it open, and if it goes more than 5 pounds, or you use like a little pogo stick thing that if you push on the bar and it takes more than 5 pounds to open it. Where this gets confusing is in non-DSA projects, there is a little more leeway with the authority having jurisdiction or the fire marshal on the project that may allow on exterior doors to have a little more opening force pressure. I don't believe they allow more operating force pressure though. So almost all major door hardware manufacturers can do 5 pounds of operating force now. If you're doing historical preservation and you're trying to use an old school bar type that has the bar across and you push it down, none of those have 5 pounds, so you would need to get an exception.
And we do have one more question.
Okay.
I saw the code citation on 32-inch clear width being called for in 11A. But what is the criteria for that in 11B and or the 2010 ADA standards?
So it is also 32 inches clear. Where the number of inches clear can change is in HCI, certain HCI levels or OSHPD projects where the requirement is 44 inches clear. But you should always have 32 inches clear.
He has an add-on, meaning it's measured at degrees open versus 180.
It's at 90 degrees. So the tape measure is put at the stop of the frame and stretched over to the edge of the door, and that has to be 32 inches clear.
And then his next comment is, what's the citation? I couldn't find it.
I think it's in there. 11B is the same as, let me move up here. 11B is the same as the IBC because an 11A has its own numbering system. Did I go past it? No, right here. So it's in 11B, it's 404 2.2.
I think that's it. I'm going to reiterate, if you would like the PowerPoint PDF, please email Valerie. It's right here on the screen. There's been a few who have requested it through chat. Once this shuts down, we won't be able to really see the chat. It's always better to go to Valerie because that's really the source you want to go to anyway.
And then if you can indulge me for a couple of minutes,
Sure.
I'd just like to tell you a little bit about ASA Abloy. So this is not part of the official program. And it's not moving. There we go. See, it worked fine during the educational part. So ASA Abloy is the global leader in access solutions. We have 70 companies we have operating companies in 70 countries. We have over 51,000 employees and we have worldwide sales of 11 billion. Okay. And these are worldwide brands and these are North American brands of hardware. So I work for DSS, which is Door Security Solutions. And we're like the marketing and services part for all of these different brands. And so we provide door hardware consulting services, training. We have a professional services division that can do for fee services like detailed punch walks, door fire door inspections. Sorry, let me do that again. Fire door inspections. And we use Opening Studio to work with writing the hardware sets and also providing that professional services piece as well. And it can provide the owner a database of their door hardware and doors. And then we're very involved in sustainability. We have a lot of testing. We've got HPDs, EPDs. We can participate in mindful materials projects or Green Circle certified. We've even done some living building projects. So this email down here, sustainabilityamericas@asaabloy.com. We have a white glove service, which will pull together all of the HPDs and EPDs and things that you would need for your lead or other certification type of documentation, and we can just pull that all together and send it to you for all of the products from ASA ABLOY used on your project. So oftentimes that's enough to provide, because it's different manufacturers, to provide most of the information in a couple of categories. And then that's it. So hopefully fairly painless commercial. So thank you all for attending. And I appreciate your time.
Thank you.